In this lesson, what we're going to do is another exam question focusing on the USA making a superpower module, and the question is this. It's asking us, to what extent did Roosevelt, Taft and Wilson seek to limit the power of big business? This is a very nice question, in my opinion, because there's a lot of things we can do and there's a lot we can tackle in this question. So first thing first, the Roosevelt we're talking about is the first Roosevelt, of course. I hope that should be very, very clear to all of us. And there are a couple of ways in which we could structure an essay like this. So you could do how the mark scheme would probably structure the essay, which is to have a list of arguments suggesting that they did seek to limit the power of big business, and then a list of arguments suggesting that they did not seek to limit the power of big business. Now, that is a perfectly valid and reasonable way in which you can structure this essay. You could also structure this essay by talking about the individual presidents as separate points within themselves. So, for example, you could do a big paragraph looking at Roosevelt, looking at the policies Roosevelt had, and analysing to what extent did Roosevelt limit the power of big business. And then do a paragraph for Taft, to what extent did Taft seek to limit the power of big business, and then finally do a big paragraph for Woodrow Wilson, and look at whether or not Woodrow Wilson went and sought to limit the power of big business. That's one way in which we could answer this question. And both of these two ways in which we could structure this question are perfectly valid within themselves. You could even structure it again temporally by taking the period from Roosevelt all the way up to Wilson and just splitting it into three. But in that regard, you might as well just split it into the three presidents, if that makes sense. So let's think about some of the arguments that we can use. Now, like I say for all of these lessons, I've said it every single time. The purpose of these videos is not to necessarily be able to regurgitate all of the information and all the specific details that we need to know for the exam for this particular question. The point is to look at exam technique, look at some of the arguments you can make, and look at how we would go about planning a question like this, and then hopefully, if this means if you watch this and you take in the information that we provide in this lesson, and if a question like this comes up in the exam, you'll have a better understanding of the kind of ways in which you can tackle a question like this, okay? And I always say as well that this list of things that I'm going to talk about is a non-exhaustive list. There are plenty of things that we can talk about. There are plenty of things that we can reference for a question like this. There are plenty of different ways we can argue either for and against the statement in question, the extent to which these presidents sought to limit the power of big business. There are lots of different ways in which we can do that. The point is just to get a general idea of the way in which we might be able to structure and plan an essay question like this. So when I went about planning this question and jotted down some notes for this question, I tackled it using the first kind of structure that I talked about, the idea of having a list of points suggesting that they did seek to limit the power of big business, and then a list of points suggesting that they did not. That's how I embarked on being able to structure this essay. In reality, if you are somebody who is, who is confident in the specific knowledge that surrounds this period of the syllabus, if you're confident in the things that you know about this particular topic, I would recommend doing a big paragraph looking at Roosevelt, looking at all the things Roosevelt did, analysing those things, really critically evaluating the extent to which Roosevelt really did limit and seek to limit the power of big business, then do a big paragraph for Taft, and then do a big paragraph for Woodrow Wilson. That's how I would probably structure it, but that's not how I've done it in terms of this structure here. But you can do it however you want, okay? So let's think about it. Let's think about, on the one hand, yes, they did. These three presidents, Roosevelt, Taft and Wilson, did seek to limit the power of big business. What kind of evidence can we look at for this? Well, generally speaking, when we're talking about the extent to which these three presidents sought to limit the power of big business, you're going to find more information on things such as antitrust legislation and anti-monopoly legislation. You're going to find these things more with Roosevelt and Wilson than you do with Taft. So let's think about what Roosevelt and Wilson did in regard to suggesting that they did seek to limit the power of big business? Well, first of all, we can start with Roosevelt. In 1890, the 1890 Sherman Act, which wasn't passed by Roosevelt, but which was embarked on, which allowed for, antitrust prosecutions to take place. In fact, Roosevelt used the 1890 Sherman Act to be able to prosecute 44 antitrust, go through 44 antitrust prosecutions. So that's one thing that we can talk about. Another thing that we can talk about is the... let me just hang on a minute. There we go. Sorry. Another thing we could do is talk about the things that Roosevelt did pass. So we can talk about, for example, the Elkins Act of 1903. That's one thing that we can talk about. Now, the Elkins Act of 1903, what it did was empower the Interstate Commerce Commission to impose heavy fines on those who let me start this again. So the Roosevelt passed the Elkins Act in 1903, and what this act did was empower the Interstate Commerce Commission to impose heavy fines on railroad companies who offered rebates, tax rebates and other kind of monetary rebates to big business. So that is a thing that Roosevelt specifically did relating to seeking to limit the power of big business. He implemented this act of legislation that empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to do this thing. Okay, so we have two things here from Roosevelt. We have him utilizing the previously established 1890 Sherman Act to prosecute, to go about 44 different antitrust prosecutions. Okay, so he wielded antitrust legislation that existed before his presidency as a way to be able to limit the power of big business in that regard. He also passed the Elkins Act of 1903, which empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to impose heavy fines on railroad companies that would offer rebates to big businesses using railroad services effectively. What about Wilson? We'll come back to Taft in a minute. What about Wilson? Well, Wilson, of course, in 1914 established the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Now, the Federal Trade Commission was designed to and established to investigate unfair trading and business practices. So looking into big business and looking at the kind of things that big business were doing to try and limit their power. We also have specific antitrust legislation passed by Wilson as well, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. Again, it does a number of things that it says in terms of breaking up quite large monopolies, etc., etc. So we can see here that we have lots of different things in which we can talk about policy under Roosevelt and under Wilson that both did quite a lot to break up some quite big businesses, quite big monopolies, and also to impose certain antitrust legislation. So that's one of the things that we can talk about. What about the other hand to this argument? What kind of things can we talk about where they were not seeking to limit the power of big business? Well, you can take all of the points that we have here, and we could argue that even though Roosevelt passed the Elkins Act in 1903, even though Wilson established the FTC in 1914, and we have the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 as well, these things weren't necessarily that successful in some regards, and we'll talk about some of the limitations for these as we go on. But I think it's worth noting that we should talk about Taft at this point. So, compared to Roosevelt and Wilson, while Taft was very pro-antitrust, many historians view his era as a president as a period where the idea of progressivism and the idea of this limiting the power of big business sort of stalled for a while. So while he was someone who supported antitrust legislation, there weren't that many real big initiatives that were quite strong when it came to antitrust and limiting the power of big businesses. So you could argue that while Roosevelt and Wilson did seek to limit the power of big business, the extent to which Taft did is a lot more questionable. You can make that argument if you wanted to. You could also talk about legislation that Roosevelt and Wilson established that were not that successful. So, for example, the 1906 Hepburn Act that was passed by Roosevelt, it was opposed by the Senate, and the effectiveness was reduced quite significantly by the Supreme Court. So, you could argue that while Roosevelt did seek to limit the power of big business, the extent to which he was successful in this regard is a lot more questionable because, of course, there are other pieces of legislation that he passed that weren't as successful as, for example, his wielding of the Sherman Act or the Elkins Act in 1903. Another point that you can make relates to Wilson's establishment of the FTC. So the Federal Trade Commission was established in 1914, and while it did obviously show an initiative and show an intention by Wilson to limit the power of big business, or at least seek to limit the power of big business, there were a lot of problems with the FTC. For example, the FTC was established to investigate, quote, unfair practices. But the concept of what actually constitutes an unfair practice was weakened because of the ambiguity of the word unfair. So we can say that while, yes, Wilson did seek to limit the power of big business, and while, yes, this was something that we can show using evidence, using specific evidence, such as, for example, the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission, there were problems with this establishment of this Trade Commission. There was ambiguities in the language that was used in its establishment, which meant that it was very difficult to really to hone in on the kind of things that the FTC was established for. So the concept and ambiguity around things like the word unfair was obviously something that was difficult to reconcile. I think any exam question and any argument that you have relating to this exam question is going to focus mainly on Roosevelt and Wilson regarding antitrust legislation. Of course, you can talk about Taft in more detail. And I think having a little bit more of an on-the-fence argument is probably best for this question. I would probably argue that overall, Roosevelt and Wilson did seek to limit the power of big business, and the extent to which Taft did was a lot more limited in the evidence. And then I would use evidence such as the Elkins Act and the wielding of the Sherman Act and the establishment of the FTC and the establishment of the Clayton Antitrust Act, all to show that Roosevelt and Wilson did seek to limit the power of big business. And then I would also critically evaluate these points by talking about the problems that Roosevelt and Wilson ran into when it came to implementing the big business and limiting the power of big business, such as obviously problems with the FTC, problems with the Hepburn Act in 1906. But then what I would do is that I would undermine that argument. I would talk about how, well, on the one hand, so I would talk about, for example, okay, yes, these people did seek to limit the power of big business. Here is the evidence. Here is the Elkins Act. Here is the Sherman Act. Here's the Clayton Antitrust Act. And then I'll say, well, on the other hand, while these things were, these did exist, okay, we still have problems with the Hepburn Act. We still have problems with the establishment of the FTC. But then I would go, well, nevertheless, despite the fact we have these problems, despite the fact that the FTC was quite ambiguous, despite the fact that the effectiveness of the Hepburn Act was undermined by the Supreme Court, it still doesn't necessarily show that Roosevelt and Wilson were not seeking to limit the power of big business. Ultimately, despite there being problems with these pieces of legislation, despite there being problems with the establishment of the FTC, despite there being problems with the Hepburn Act, it still showed that they had the motivation or the intention to limit the power of big business. That would be my argument, okay? And I would argue that for Roosevelt and Wilson, and I would argue that Taft was a lot more questionable in his ability to limit the power of big business. That's just how I would structure it. The point isn't for me to give you the right answer. The point is to just discuss some of the points that we would make and discuss some of the ways in which we might answer this question. We'll do more questions for making a superpower USA. We'll do some more relating to the New Deal under the other Roosevelt. And we'll do some relating to US foreign policy, specifically the conflict in Vietnam and the impact of the war in Vietnam as well. So stay tuned for those lessons in the future.